I first arrived in the Sahara, I was just struck by how utterly barren it was. It's like the color green was removed from the palette when they made this place. Just nothing, grays and browns, and not a scrap of life.
Imagine looking at the largest hot desert on Earth and thinking, you know what this place needs? More bees. No, seriously. A group of ambitious experts believe that if they could bring enough pollinators into one of the harshest environments on Earth, they might be able to kickstart life itself. The goal sounded simple enough: help plants grow, bring back vegetation, and slow the desert's spread. But what happened next became a brutal lesson in how nature doesn't care about our plans. So why did millions of bees fail where a few holes in the sand eventually succeeded? The plan that sounded wild but wasn't totally crazy. All right, let's back up, because before we roast this experiment, we need to understand why it happened in the first place, because the problem it was trying to solve is actually terrifying. The Sahara Desert isn't just sitting there, minding its business. It's moving, slowly, steadily, relentlessly. It's been swallowing up the Sahel, that band of semi-arid land that sits just south of the Sahara, spanning across Africa from Senegal all the way to Sudan. This process is called desertification, and it is not a slow background hum of a problem. It's a crisis. It's been devastating communities, wiping out farmland, collapsing local economies, and pushing entire ecosystems to the brink for decades. The Sahel isn't supposed to be pure desert. It's a transitional region that has supported farming, grazing, and communities for thousands of years. But climate change, deforestation, overgrazing, and soil degradation have weakened the land, allowing the Sahara to creep steadily southward. So scientists, conservationists, NGOs, and government agencies have been throwing ideas at this problem for decades. And the central challenge they kept running into is this: once an ecosystem degrades past a certain point, it doesn't just bounce back on its own. You can't just leave it alone and hope for the best. The processes that would allow it to recover have themselves been disrupted. You've lost the plants that held soil in place. You've lost the insects that pollinated those plants. You've lost the birds that spread seeds. Everything is interconnected, and when enough threads get pulled, the whole fabric starts to unravel in ways that become increasingly hard to reverse. The conventional wisdom for a long time was plant trees. The idea being that trees are the anchor of a functioning ecosystem. They shade the ground, reduce evaporation. Their roots break up compacted soil and pull up water from deeper layers. Their fallen leaves add organic matter that improves soil quality. Their canopy creates a microclimate that allows other plants to grow. Plant enough trees, the thinking went, and you can start to turn the tide. But tree planting campaigns across the Sahel, while not without success in some areas, kept running into the same stubborn wall. When the underlying conditions are bad enough, the trees die before they can establish. The soil can't support them. The water runs off before roots can access it. You plant, the trees struggle, the trees die, and you're back where you started, just with less money and more frustration. So researchers started looking at the problem from a different angle. Rather than trying to restore the ecosystem by planting the end-state vegetation directly, what if you started with the building blocks? What if you introduced the agents of ecological recovery, the organisms that would, in a functioning ecosystem, be doing the pollination and seed spreading and soil-enriching work that allows plants to thrive in the first place? What if you started with bees? The logic, when you lay it out, is genuinely compelling. Bees are pollinators. They're not passive. They actively move between plants, transferring pollen, enabling reproduction in plant species that can't self-fertilize. In a healthy ecosystem, bees and plants co-evolve. They need each other. Introduce bees into an area with even marginal vegetation, and you could theoretically accelerate plant reproduction, create more food sources for the bees, expand the bee population, which pollinates more plants, which creates more food, which attracts more insects and birds, and suddenly you've got that cascade effect going. The ecosystem starts to rebuild itself, with the bees acting as the initial catalyst. It's the kind of idea that looks great on a whiteboard. The kind of idea that, when you're presenting it to a funding committee, sounds like exactly the bold, innovative, outside-the-box thinking that this big, complicated problem needs. The desert, however, was not on the funding committee. So what actually happened when those hives hit the ground? Buckle up, because the answer is not pretty. The desert said absolutely not. Let's walk through what this experiment actually looked like in practice, because the details matter here, and because some of what's been reported about it online is, to put it charitably, a little confused. First, the bees were not frozen. I want to address that up front because the phrase frozen bees has been floating around in discussions of this project, and it's inaccurate in a way that actually obscures what made this experiment ambitious. The bees were refrigerated, kept at a controlled low temperature during transport to keep the colonies calm and viable through the journey into a hostile environment. That's a meaningful logistical achievement. Transporting millions of live bees in functioning, stable hive structures into remote stretches of the Sahara is not a small undertaking. It required coordination, resources, careful temperature management, and a level of optimism that, in retrospect, might have bordered on hubris. The plan was this: get the refrigerated hives into position, install them in the target area, allow the bees to gradually warm up to ambient temperature, and let nature take its course. The hives would give the colonies a stable base. The bees would emerge, start foraging, start pollinating whatever vegetation was present, and the ecological cascade would begin. What nobody had fully accounted for, or perhaps hadn't fully reckoned with in visceral, practical terms, was what ambient temperature means in the Sahara. The ground temperature in the Sahara can reach 70 degrees Celsius or 158 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not grab some sunscreen hot. That's maybe don't touch anything with your bare hands hot, and that was just the ground. Inside the hives, temperatures climbed even higher. A hive in direct Saharan sun, sitting on ground that's already at 70 degrees Celsius with no shade, no wind, no humidity to provide any cooling effect whatsoever. The interior temperature of those structures became something that can only be described as catastrophic. Then the wax combs started melting, and that's a disaster, because the honeycomb isn't just storage space. It's the entire infrastructure of the colony. And when the structure of the hive collapses, the colony collapses with it. There's nowhere for the bees to go. The queen is lost in the chaos. The brood dies. The colony, without its structural foundation, cannot function, cannot survive, cannot even begin the process of rebuilding in conditions like these. Zoologists later described the hives as thermal traps, which is a very scientific way of saying the bees accidentally moved into an oven. These weren't neglected hives. These were carefully prepared, expensively transported, thoughtfully installed hives. And they killed every colony inside them, not through any malice or negligence, but simply because the environment was fundamentally, categorically incompatible with life as bees understand it. The desert's response to the experiment was, as researchers described it, heat, dust, and failure. Every colony died, not most of them, not a majority of them, every single one. The experiment that was supposed to kickstart the ecological recovery of degraded Saharan land didn't just fail to kickstart anything, it didn't even produce a survivor. The Sahara swallowed it whole and left nothing behind but collapsed wax and the very expensive lesson that you cannot simply impose life on a landscape that isn't ready to support it. But here's the really sharp question, the one that stings most when you sit with it. Even if the bees had somehow survived, would any of it have actually worked? The question that changes everything. This is where the story stops being just a sad tale about dead bees and becomes something more important, a genuine rethink of how we approach ecological restoration and, honestly, how we approach complex problems in general. Because the failure of the bee colonies forced researchers to ask a question that maybe should have been asked more loudly before the hives ever left the refrigeration unit. Why exactly is the Sahel losing its vegetation in the first place? Researchers eventually realized they had been focusing on symptoms rather than causes. The real problem wasn't a lack of bees or even a lack of plants. It was water. In heavily degraded areas of the Sahel, rain wasn't soaking into the soil. Instead, it ran off hard, compacted ground and disappeared before plants could use it. Without water retention, vegetation couldn't recover, and without vegetation, pollinators had nothing to support them. The lesson became clear. If rain cannot soak in, almost nothing thrives. And here's the part that should make you put your hands over your face a little. Bees can't fix that. They physically cannot fix that. Pollination is irrelevant if the plants being pollinated can't get enough water to survive. Trees can't fix it either, not if you're planting them into soil that sheds water like a duck sheds rain. You can introduce as much biology as you want, bees, trees, grasses, any of it, and it all runs into the same wall. The foundation isn't there. The most basic physical requirement for terrestrial plant life, access to water, isn't being met. Everything built on top of that foundation is built on sand, quite literally. The bee experiment, for all its cost and all its tragedy, did something useful. It forced a hard look at decades of restoration efforts that had kept trying to add biology to landscapes without first fixing the underlying water problem, and kept getting the same results. Occasional patchy successes where conditions happened to be just right. Widespread failure everywhere else. What was needed wasn't a more sophisticated biological intervention. What was needed was something much more basic, and in its own way, much more radical. The solution that makes you go, "That's it?" Brace yourself, because the gap between the failed solution and the solution that worked is almost comically wide. No refrigeration units, no coordinated transport of millions of insects across a desert, no cutting-edge biotech, no sophisticated ecological engineering, no expensive scientific apparatus of any kind. What started producing measurable results in the fight against Sahelian desertification was this: half-moon-shaped pits dug into the ground. Seriously, farmers and conservation workers in the Sahel began experimenting with digging small, crescent-shaped depressions in degraded land. The shape is deliberate and elegant in its simplicity. The flat side of the crescent faces uphill, and the curved side faces downhill, which means that when rain falls, instead of running off across the impermeable surface and disappearing, it gets intercepted by the pit. It pools inside the curved depression, and crucially, it sits there. It doesn't move. It doesn't evaporate immediately. It stays in contact with the soil long enough to actually infiltrate, long enough to soak in. That's the entire mechanism. That's the whole invention. A hole in the ground shaped like a crescent moon. And the results have been, depending on your frame of reference, either modest and incremental, if you're a scientist presenting to a committee, or genuinely astonishing, if you're a farmer in the Sahel who watched your land die for a decade and then watched it start coming back. What happens when water starts soaking into degraded Sahelian soil is almost magical to witness, even though the science behind it is completely straightforward. Seeds that have been lying dormant in the soil, sometimes for years, waiting for exactly this, for a moment when conditions might allow them to germinate, suddenly get the signal they've been waiting for. They sprout. Grasses emerge. And grasses, even thin, scrubby, drought-resistant grasses, are the beginning of everything. Grass roots break up compacted soil. Grass leaves, when they die and decompose, add organic matter back to the earth. Organic matter improves the soil's ability to hold water, which means the next time it rains, more water soaks in, which means more seeds germinate, which means more organic matter accumulates, which means even more water is retained, which means shrubs can start to establish, which means eventually, when the shrubs have been going long enough, you might be ready to start thinking about trees, and insects, and birds, and yes, eventually, bees. The cascade effect that the bee experiment was trying to trigger from the top down started happening naturally, from the bottom up, just by solving the water problem first. Areas where these half-moon pits had been installed started showing vegetation recovery after rainy seasons. Not overnight. This isn't a miracle. Degraded land doesn't bounce back in a year or two, but the direction changed. Instead of continuing to deteriorate, the land started, slowly but genuinely, to recover. The Sahara's advance was slowing in places where it had previously seemed unstoppable. And here's one of the most important aspects of this solution. Communities can implement it themselves. You don't need outside funding to import refrigerated hives. You don't need a scientific institution to coordinate the logistics. You need people with basic tools and the knowledge of how to dig a particular shape of pit in a particular orientation. It scales. It can be taught. It empowers the communities that are most directly affected by desertification to be the agents of their own landscape's recovery. That's not nothing. In the long, often dispiriting history of international development interventions that created dependency rather than capacity, a solution that local communities can own and implement themselves is genuinely significant. But zoom out with me for a second, because there's a bigger lesson buried in all of this that goes way beyond the Sahara, the lesson nobody wants to hear. The Sahara bee experiment is really a story about a very human mistake, not a stupid mistake. Not a reckless one, just a mistake people make all the time. When we see a problem, our instinct is to look at what's missing and add it back. No pollinators? Add pollinators. No trees? Plant trees. No vegetation? Bring in something that helps vegetation grow. The logic sounds perfectly reasonable because technically it's true. Degraded land in the Sahel lacks pollinators and vegetation. But the mistake wasn't in the observation. The mistake was assuming those missing things were the cause of the problem rather than the result of it. The bee experiment asked, what does a healthy ecosystem have that this one doesn't? The answer was bees. So they brought bees. What they didn't ask was why the ecosystem lacked bees in the first place. Follow that question long enough and you eventually arrive at the real issue. There weren't enough plants to support pollinators. The plants weren't thriving because the soil couldn't hold water. And if the soil can't hold water, almost nothing else matters. The experiment was trying to solve a problem 3 steps downstream from the actual problem. And honestly, this pattern shows up everywhere. Communities get expensive technology before they have the infrastructure to support it. Businesses throw money at visible problems while ignoring the systems creating them. People treat symptoms while the underlying cause keeps getting worse. Different situations, same mistake. Complex solution, wrong layer. That's why the biggest lesson from this entire saga is surprisingly simple. Before you add bees, trees, or any other biology, you have to fix how water meets the ground. Everything else comes after that. The hopeful part is that fixing the foundation turned out to be possible. It didn't require futuristic technology or some breakthrough scientific miracle. It required people to stop asking what a healthy ecosystem looks like and start asking what a struggling ecosystem actually needs. And the answer turned out to be a curved hole in the ground, which, let's be honest, is probably not the ending anybody expected after hearing about millions of transported bees. The Sahara's advance hasn't been reversed, and the desertification crisis isn't over. These are challenges measured in decades, not years. But in some of the hardest hit areas, the trend has begun to shift. Land, once considered beyond recovery, has started showing signs of life again. Not because people found a way to outsmart nature, but because they finally stopped fighting the wrong problem. So here's where we land. The Sahara bee experiment failed completely and catastrophically. Millions of bees died, significant resources were wasted, and the desert remained unmoved. But the failure wasn't pointless. It was part of a longer, messier, more honest reckoning with what it actually takes to fight desertification. A reckoning that eventually led back to something so simple it almost feels like a joke. Dig a curved hole. Catch some rain. Give the ground a chance to drink. The desert didn't need bees. It needed someone to stop assuming they knew what the desert needed and start actually listening to what the land was telling them. Sometimes the most important thing science does isn't discover something new. Sometimes it's finally, honestly acknowledge something that was always there, hiding in plain sight, in the shape of rain running off ground that should have absorbed it. If this video made you look at something familiar a little differently, whether that's deserts or ecosystems, or just the way we tend to approach hard problems, that's exactly what I'm here for. Hit subscribe if you want more of this kind of deep dive into the stories behind the headlines, the science that doesn't always make the front page, but genuinely deserves to. Drop a comment and let me know what surprised you most. I genuinely read them. And share this with someone who'd find it as fascinating as you did. See you in the next one.